Imagine standing under a vast, star-filled sky, the quiet whisper of the night surrounding you. As you gaze upward, a promise is spoken into your heart, a promise so grand, so incredible, that it seems impossible. This is how Abraham's journey began, with a promise from God that would change the course of his life and the lives of generations to come. In this story, we will explore the incredible faith of Abraham and the ultimate test he faced with his beloved son, Isaac. In a world filled with uncertainties and challenges, Abraham's story stands as a beacon of hope and trust in God's perfect plan. From the moment God called him to leave everything behind to the moment he stood ready to sacrifice Isaac, Abraham's faith never wavered. Through his journey, we learn powerful lessons about obedience, trust, and the unfailing promises of God. As you walk with Abraham through this story, you will discover insights into your own walk with God. Whether you are in a season of waiting, facing a challenge that tests your faith, or seeking a deeper understanding of God's plan for your life, Abraham's story speaks to the heart of what it means to trust in God completely. Together, let us explore this timeless narrative and uncover the lessons that continue to inspire us today. Abraham's story begins with a moment that would change the course of his life and history itself. God called him to leave everything familiar, his homeland, his family, and his past. Imagine Abraham at an advanced age, hearing this voice that promised something extraordinary, yet unknown. It must have stirred a mix of excitement and fear within him, as it does in all of us when we stand at the threshold of change. But God's call came with a promise that would require great faith. As Abraham set out on this journey, leaving behind the known comforts of his life, he stepped into the great unknown with only God's word as his guide. How many times have we, too, been called to step out in faith, not knowing what lies ahead? Abraham's obedience in the face of uncertainty reminds us that the first step is always the hardest, but it's also the one that opens the door to God's greatest blessings. Abraham didn't know where his journey would lead, but he trusted in the one who called him. This is where faith truly begins, when we choose to trust God's promises, even when the path ahead seems unclear. In moments of doubt or hesitation, we can look to Abraham's example and find strength in the fact that God is always faithful to his word. There's something comforting in knowing that Abraham was human, just like us. He had fears, uncertainties, and moments of weakness. Yet his willingness to trust God above all else allowed him to become the father of a great nation. It's a reminder that God doesn't require perfection from us, only a heart that is willing to follow him. As we reflect on Abraham's call, it challenges us to think about our own journey. Have we heard God's voice calling us to something new, something beyond our comfort zone? And if so, are we ready to take that first step, trusting that he will guide us, just as he guided Abraham? Without realizing it, Abraham's journey wasn't just about his own life. It was the beginning of a legacy, a story that would stretch far beyond his own years, impacting generations. And so, as we take our own steps of faith, we, too, are part of something much bigger than ourselves. Abraham's journey of faith was marked by an astonishing promise from God, one that seemed impossible by human standards. God promised Abraham that he would be the father of many nations and that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the sky. But there was a challenge. Abraham and his wife, Sarah, were both old, and Sarah was barren. How could they possibly have children in such circumstances? Yet God's promises are never limited by human impossibilities. Imagine the conversations Abraham and Sarah must have had. How many times might they have looked at each other, wondering how this promise would ever come to pass? It's in moments like these that faith is truly tested. When the situation seems impossible, do we cling to hope or do we give in to doubt? Abraham chose to trust, even when it didn't make sense. We too often find ourselves in situations where God's promises seem distant or unreachable. Maybe we're waiting for an answer to prayer or for a breakthrough in a difficult season of life. In those moments, we can learn from Abraham's example and hold fast to the truth that God's timing is perfect, even when it feels like nothing is happening. God's promise to Abraham wasn't just about one man and his family. It was about something much larger. Through Abraham, God would establish a covenant, a relationship with his people that would extend throughout history. The birth of Isaac would be the first step in fulfilling that covenant, showing that nothing is too difficult for God. As we consider the incredible promise that God gave to Abraham, we're reminded that God's promises to us are just as powerful today. Whether we're facing challenges, delays, or doubts, we can trust that God is faithful to his word. Sometimes, like Abraham, we just need to wait a little longer than we expect. Abraham's story encourages us to hold on, even when the promise seems far away. God's faithfulness never fails, and his promises always come to pass, even when the road seems uncertain. Abraham and Sarah waited many years for God's promise to be fulfilled. As time passed, the weight of that waiting began to test their hope. It's not easy to hold on to hope when days turn into months, and months into years, with no sign of change. Abraham and Sarah's faith was tested in ways that we, too, experience through long periods of waiting and the silence that sometimes comes with it. In those moments of waiting, it's natural to question whether God has forgotten us. Abraham and Sarah certainly wrestled with these thoughts. At one point, they even took matters into their own hands when Sarah suggested that Abraham have a child with her servant, Hagar. This decision led to consequences that would affect their family for generations, showing us that sometimes our impatience can lead us off course. The test of time is something we all face. Whether it's waiting for healing, reconciliation, or answers to prayers, the longer we wait, the harder it can be to stay hopeful. But God's promises don't have expiration dates. Even when we can't see the evidence, he is working behind the scenes in ways we don't always understand. Abraham's journey reminds us that hope is not about immediate results. It's about trusting in God's perfect timing. Even when we feel like giving up, we can find comfort in knowing that God's plan is always for our good, even if the process takes longer than we'd like. Abraham's hope was challenged, but it was never extinguished. As you reflect on Abraham and Sarah's experience, think about the areas in your life where you might be feeling the weight of waiting. How can you renew your hope and trust in God's timing? Sometimes, all we need is a reminder that God's promises are worth waiting for, no matter how long it takes. If this message has touched your heart, share in the comments how your faith has been tested during times of waiting. Or if you'd like to simply connect, type the word hope and let us know that you are standing in faith with us on this journey. After years of waiting, hoping and trusting, the moment finally came when God's promise was fulfilled. Sarah, long past the age of childbearing, gave birth to Isaac, the son of promise. This was more than just the birth of a child. It was the manifestation of God's faithfulness. Abraham and Sarah's joy must have been overwhelming as they held their newborn son, the physical proof that God had kept his word. Isaac's birth didn't just bring joy to Abraham and Sarah. It was a reminder to all of us that God's timing is always perfect. Even when it feels like he is late, his plan unfolds in ways that exceed our understanding. The arrival of Isaac was a miracle, and it reminds us that God is in the business of doing the impossible, especially when all hope seems lost. Think about the times in your life when you've seen a long-awaited prayer answered. The joy and relief that come with those moments are unlike any other. Like Abraham and Sarah, we are reminded that waiting on God is never in vain. His promises are always worth the wait, even when it feels like the time will never come. The birth of Isaac wasn't just about fulfilling a promise to Abraham and Sarah. It was a pivotal moment in God's greater plan for humanity. Isaac's life would carry forward the covenant God made with Abraham, and through Isaac, the future generations would be blessed. Sometimes, the things we wait for aren't just for us. They are part of a larger story that God is weaving. As we reflect on the fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham, it invites us to trust that God is also working in our lives, even when the road seems long. When we hold on to hope and faith, we position ourselves to receive the blessings that God has promised. Abraham and Sarah's joy was not just in the birth of Isaac, but in knowing that God had been faithful to them through every trial and every moment of doubt. And so it is with us. God's faithfulness sustains us through the waiting and brings joy when the promise is finally fulfilled. Just when Abraham thought his journey of faith had reached its pinnacle with the birth of Isaac, God called him to an even greater test. God commanded Abraham to sacrifice his beloved son, Isaac, the very child that had been promised and miraculously given to him. This moment would become one of the most profound displays of faith in the entire Bible. Abraham faced a heart-wrenching dilemma: obey God's command or protect the life of his only son. The emotional weight of this test is unimaginable. Abraham had waited so long for Isaac, and now he was being asked to give him up. Yet, despite the pain and confusion, Abraham didn't hesitate. He rose early the next morning and began the journey to the place where the sacrifice would take place. This act of obedience, though difficult, demonstrates the depth of Abraham's trust in God. He believed that even if Isaac's life was taken, God could still fulfill his promises. In our own lives, we may not be asked to make such extreme sacrifices, but we all face moments when God asks us to let go of something we hold dear. It might be a dream, a relationship, or a plan we've clung to for years. In those moments, we're called to trust that God's ways are higher than ours, and that his plans for us are good, even when they seem difficult or painful. Abraham's willingness to offer Isaac teaches us that true faith is not just about believing in God's promises. It's about trusting his heart, even when his plans seem incomprehensible. Sometimes we must be willing to release what we love most into God's hands, trusting that he knows what is best for us. As Abraham and Isaac climbed Mount Moriah, with each step, the tension between obedience and heartbreak must have weighed heavily on Abraham's heart. Yet he kept going, trusting that God would provide a way. And in the end, God did provide a ram caught in the thicket, a substitute for Isaac. This moment reminds us that God never asks us for more than he is willing to give. Abraham's test of faith points us to a greater truth: God's ultimate provision in the sacrifice of his own son, Jesus. Just as Abraham's faith was tested, our faith is refined in moments of sacrifice and surrender, teaching us to trust God in all things. The journey to Mount Moriah was not just a physical one, it was a spiritual journey, a test of both Abraham's faith and Isaac's trust. The Bible tells us that Abraham traveled for 3 days with his son, carrying the weight of God's command in his heart. Every step must have felt like a burden, knowing what was expected of him. Yet Abraham pressed on, his faith in God unwavering, even though the path ahead was filled with uncertainty and pain. Isaac, though young, was old enough to understand that something was missing. As they approached the place of sacrifice, Isaac asked a simple but profound question: "Father, where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham's response, "God will provide," wasn't just an answer to his son, it was a declaration of faith in the God who had always been faithful. This moment between father and son speaks to the depth of Abraham's belief that God, somehow, would make a way. The relationship between Abraham and Isaac during this journey is a powerful example of trust and obedience. Isaac followed his father without fully understanding what was happening, just as we are often called to follow God without knowing all the details of his plan. Abraham's faith and Isaac's trust serve as a model for us in our own spiritual journeys, where we may not always have clear answers, but are asked to walk in faith. The climb up Mount Moriah was a journey into the unknown, but it was also a journey toward God's provision. Sometimes, the greatest acts of faith happen in the middle of uncertainty, when we can't see how things will turn out. Abraham's trust in God, even when faced with losing his most precious gift, teaches us that faith isn't about understanding. It's about believing that God is good, no matter the circumstances. As we reflect on this journey, we're reminded that there are times in our own lives when we must climb our own Mount Moriah, facing challenges or decisions that test our faith. It's in these moments that we are called to trust God's provision, even when we don't know what the outcome will be. Like Abraham, we are asked to walk by faith, trusting that God will meet us on the mountain. Abraham's journey to Mount Moriah wasn't just about the test of sacrifice, it was about the discovery of God's faithfulness. With every step, Abraham trusted in God's promise, and with every moment, God was preparing to reveal his provision. As Abraham and Isaac reached the top of Mount Moriah, the tension of the moment was almost unbearable. Abraham, following God's command, prepared the altar and bound Isaac, his beloved son. In these moments, the depth of Abraham's faith was fully revealed. He was willing to surrender the most precious thing in his life, trusting completely that God's plan was perfect, even if he couldn't understand it. This was the moment of truth, not only for Abraham, but for the generations that would come after him. Isaac, too, demonstrated incredible trust in his father and ultimately in God. He allowed himself to be bound and placed on the altar, an act that mirrors the trust we are called to have in God, even when we don't understand the reason behind his plans. This moment symbolizes the ultimate surrender to God's will, teaching us that true faith requires us to trust God, even when the situation seems impossible. But just as Abraham was about to sacrifice his son, God intervened. An angel of the Lord called out to Abraham, stopping him and providing a ram caught in the thicket as a substitute for Isaac. This powerful act of provision is a reminder that God always provides, even in the most desperate and testing of times. When we place our faith in Him, God makes a way where there seems to be none. The story of Abraham and Isaac on Mount Moriah isn't just about obedience. It's about the profound truth that God never leaves us without hope. Just as God provided a ram for Abraham, He provides for us in our times of need. The phrase Jehovah Jireh, meaning the Lord will provide, was born from this moment, reminding us that God's provision is always present in our lives. In our own lives, we may face moments where we feel like we are on the altar, moments of sacrifice, testing, and uncertainty. It's in these times that we are invited to remember that God is faithful and that He will provide a way through, just as He did for Abraham. When we trust in His provision, we discover the peace that comes from knowing that God is always in control. Abraham's moment of truth on Mount Moriah shows us that faith in God is never misplaced. He is a provider, a sustainer, and a loving father who cares for his children in every situation. The story of Abraham and Isaac didn't end with the test on Mount Moriah. After demonstrating his unwavering faith, Abraham experienced a profound moment of God's blessing. The Lord spoke to Abraham, reaffirming the promises He had made so long ago. God declared that because of Abraham's faithfulness, his descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore. This was a powerful confirmation that Abraham's obedience had not only strengthened his relationship with God, but also ensured the future of his family and the nation that would come from him. This blessing was more than just words, it was a covenant. a promise that extended far beyond Abraham's lifetime. Through his faithfulness, Abraham became the father of nations, and the blessings he received continued to flow through his descendants. The Bible tells us that all nations of the earth would be blessed because of him. This moment is a reminder that our acts of faith have ripple effects, touching the lives of those around us and even the generations that follow. In our own lives, we may not face the exact same tests as Abraham, but our faithfulness to God can still unlock blessings in ways we may never fully understand. When we choose to trust and obey, we open the door for God's favor to flow into our lives, affecting not only ourselves but also those we love. Faithfulness, as Abraham's life shows us, is about trusting God in every circumstance, even when the path is unclear. God's blessing to Abraham also reveals his nature as a loving and generous father. He delights in blessing his children, especially when they walk in faith. The trials Abraham faced were difficult, but they led to the outpouring of God's favor, showing that obedience and trust in God always lead to reward, even if it's not immediate. As we reflect on Abraham's story, we can find encouragement in knowing that God sees our faithfulness and he honors it. We may not always see the full picture, but God's promises are sure. His blessings are often greater than we can imagine, and they come at just the right time, just as they did for Abraham. Abraham's faithfulness continues to inspire us today, reminding us that God's blessings are not only for our benefit, but for the generations that come after us. His faith left a legacy that has endured through the ages, and our faith can leave a legacy in the lives of those we influence as well. Abraham's story is more than just a narrative from ancient times. It continues to resonate with us today, thousands of years later. His journey of faith, marked by both triumphs and trials, speaks to the challenges we all face in our walk with God. In a world filled with uncertainty, doubt, and fear, Abraham's unwavering trust in God stands as a timeless example of what it means to live by faith. One of the most profound impacts of Abraham's story is the way it encourages us to trust God's promises, even when they seem distant or impossible. Abraham waited many years to see God's promises fulfilled, and in that waiting, he grew in his faith. Today, many of us find ourselves in seasons of waiting for answers, waiting for breakthroughs, or waiting for God's direction. Abraham reminds us that the waiting is not wasted time. It's during these periods that our faith is strengthened, just as his was. Abraham's willingness to obey God, even when it meant great personal sacrifice, also speaks to the kind of faith we are called to have. In our lives, we may not be asked to sacrifice as Abraham was, but we are often called to let go of things that are precious to us, trusting that God's plans are better. Abraham's faith encourages us to surrender our desires, dreams, and fears to God, knowing that his will is always perfect. The impact of Abraham's story goes beyond individual faith. It reminds us that our lives are part of a larger plan, God's plan for his people. Through Abraham, the covenant was established, and through that covenant, we are blessed. Abraham's story is a foundational part of the story of salvation, leading all the way to Jesus Christ, the ultimate fulfillment of God's promises. In today's world, where we often seek quick solutions and immediate gratification, Abraham's story challenges us to embrace patience and trust. His life shows us that faith is not always about immediate results, but about walking faithfully with God. Even when the path is long and winding, Abraham's impact is felt in every believer who chooses to trust God, even when the answers are slow in coming. As we reflect on Abraham's journey, we are reminded that his story is, in many ways, our story too. We are all called to walk by faith, to trust in God's promises, and to believe that he will provide. The impact of Abraham's faith continues to inspire generations of believers to this day, encouraging us to keep trusting, keep hoping, and keep believing in the God who always keeps his word. The story of Abraham and Isaac isn't just a tale of faith from the past. It's a symbol of faith that continues to inspire future generations. The powerful moment on Mount Moriah, where Abraham was willing to sacrifice his son, serves as a lasting example of what it means to trust God with everything. This act of obedience echoes through the ages, reminding us that faith often requires us to step into the unknown, trusting that God's plans are always good. Abraham's legacy of faith is passed down through the generations, not just to his descendants, but to all of us who walk by faith today. His willingness to trust God, even when the outcome was uncertain, speaks to the kind of faith we are called to have in our own lives. It's a faith that goes beyond mere belief. It's a faith that acts, obeys, and surrenders fully to God's will. For future generations, Abraham's story becomes a cornerstone of what it means to live a life dedicated to God. His life teaches us that faith is not a one-time event, but a journey. It's a journey that involves waiting, trusting, and sometimes sacrificing, but always believing that God's promises will come to pass. Abraham's example challenges us to live with the same kind of deep, unwavering faith that he demonstrated. Isaac's role in this story is equally important. As the son of promise, he represents the fulfillment of God's covenant, but he also shows us the importance of trust and obedience. Isaac trusted his father and ultimately trusted God, even when he didn't fully understand what was happening. This kind of trust is a powerful lesson for us all, especially in a world that often values self-reliance over dependence on God. As we look to the future, the story of Abraham and Isaac continues to serve as a guide for how we can live our lives in faith. It encourages us to trust God with our most precious things, our dreams, our loved ones, our future, knowing that He will always provide. This story reminds us that true faith is about letting go of control and placing everything in God's hands. For future generations, Abraham's story is more than just history. It's a reminder that God is always faithful, His promises endure, and His love for His people never fails. As we pass down the story of Abraham and Isaac, we are passing down a legacy of faith that will continue to inspire, encourage, and strengthen those who come after us. As we reach the end of Abraham's story, we are reminded that faith is not always easy, but it is always rewarded. Abraham's journey of trust and obedience, from the moment he left his homeland to the moment he stood ready to sacrifice his son, is a powerful testament to the kind of faith God calls us to have. It's a faith that trusts in the unseen, believes in the impossible, and holds fast to the promises of God, no matter the circumstances. Through Abraham's unwavering faith, we see God's unwavering faithfulness. The same God who provided a ram for Abraham and spared Isaac is the God who continues to provide for us today. He sees our struggles, our sacrifices, and our moments of doubt, and He is always ready to meet us with His grace and provision. Just as Abraham discovered on Mount Moriah, God is the ultimate provider, and His plans for us are always for good. As you reflect on the lessons from Abraham's story, I encourage you to consider how this message applies to your own life. Where is God calling you to step out in faith? What promises are you holding on to, waiting for their fulfillment? Trust that God sees you and that His timing is perfect. His promises never fail, and His provision is always enough. Let's close with a prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, thank You for the incredible story of Abraham, for his faith, and for the powerful lessons it teaches us. Help us to trust You with everything in our lives, knowing that You are always faithful. Give us the strength to walk in obedience, even when the road is difficult, and remind us daily that you are our provider. Bless each person reading this message, and may they experience your love and provision in a fresh, new way. In Jesus' name, amen. If this message has encouraged you, please share it with friends and family who might also be blessed by it. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss out on uplifting content like this.